I used to think apartment hallways were the safest part of a building. They were bright, narrow, public. Even late at night, they felt like places where nothing could really happen because every door belonged to somebody. Families, couples, students, elderly people. Normal lives just a few feet away on either side. That changed for me when I was 26 and renting a one-bedroom on the fourth floor of an old building in Tulsa. It wasn't some crumbling horror movie place. It was cheap, sure, but clean enough. 4 floors, 2 long hallways on each level, beige carpet, pale yellow walls, those dim ceiling lights that buzzed faintly if you listened for too long. The kind of place where the smell of someone's cooking always lingered in the air and where you could hear televisions through walls if the building got quiet enough. I worked late shifts at a hospital doing billing, so I usually got home a little after midnight. By then, most of the building was asleep. I'd take the elevator up, walk the same stretch of hallway, unlock my door, and go straight inside without thinking much about it. For the first 2 months, nothing happened. Then, one Thursday night, I stepped out of the elevator and saw a man standing all the way at the far end of the hallway. He was just there, perfectly still. My apartment was near the middle, so I noticed him right away because nobody usually stood around up there at that hour. He was too far away for me to make out details clearly, but I could tell he was facing in my direction, not leaning against a wall, not looking at his phone, just standing with his arms at his sides. I slowed down for maybe half a second, then told myself he was probably waiting for someone. I kept walking. The hallway was long enough that our footsteps should have echoed if he moved, but he didn't. He stayed there while I reached my door, unlocked it, and glanced back one last time before stepping inside. Still there. I locked the deadbolt and stood in the dark living room for a moment, listening to my own breathing, feeling stupid for being unsettled. People stand in hallways. It happens. The next night, he was there again. Same end of the hallway, same still posture. This time, I looked harder. He seemed tall, maybe 6 feet or a little over, wearing dark clothes, a hoodie or jacket, I couldn't tell. His face was hard to make out because one of the ceiling lights near that end had gone dim, and he was half in shadow. I remember I actually gave him a little nod, like the automatic polite acknowledgement you give strangers in apartment buildings. He didn't nod back, didn't wave, didn't shift his weight. Nothing. I went inside faster that time and looked through the peephole after locking the door. The angle from my door only showed part of the hall, but I could still see a section leading toward the far end. He wasn't in view anymore. I thought maybe he'd gone into one of the last apartments. The weird part was, I never heard a door open or close. By the third night, I was annoyed more than scared. The human brain hates patterns like that. If something strange happens once, you can dismiss it. Twice, maybe it's a coincidence. 3 times, at almost the exact same spot, same time, same stillness, it starts taking up space in your head. So when I got off the elevator and saw him again, I decided I was going to deal with it. I started walking normally, then stopped halfway down the hall and called out, "You good?" My voice sounded too loud in that empty space. No answer. He stayed still. I tried again, louder. "Hey, do you live here?" Nothing. I wish I could say I marched right up to him, but I didn't. Something about the way he stood there made that feel wrong immediately. It wasn't just that he was motionless, it was that he looked placed there, like a person in a photograph. I backed up a little, went to my apartment, got inside, and locked the door. Then I called the front desk. Our building had a night security guy, though security mostly meant an older man downstairs who watched cameras and told people to keep noise down. I told him there was a man lingering on the 4th floor and not responding when spoken to. He said he'd check it out. I watched through the peephole for maybe 2 minutes before I saw the elevator doors open and the security guy step out. He was heavyset, wearing the building polo shirt, holding a flashlight he definitely didn't need. He looked down the hall toward the far end. Then he started walking that way. I couldn't see the man from my angle anymore, but I watched the security guard get closer and closer to that end of the corridor. He never sped up or reacted. He just walked until he disappeared past the point my peephole allowed. A few seconds later, I heard him say faintly, "Hello?" Then, after a pause, "Sir?" Then silence. He came back into view maybe 20 seconds later, slower than before. He stopped near my door and looked around like he was trying to figure something out. I opened the door with the chain still on and asked, "Well?" He looked at me strangely and said, "There's nobody down there." I told him I'd been seeing the same man for 3 nights. He gave me the kind of tired smile people give when they think you're overreacting, but don't want to say it out loud. He said maybe it was another tenant who stepped inside when he came up. I told him I didn't hear any door. He shrugged and said, "Walls are thick." Then he left. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I brought it up to the woman in 4B while we were getting mail. She was probably in her 60s, lived alone, and seemed to know everything about the building. When I described the man at the end of the hall, her face changed in a way I still remember. Not shocked, more like deeply irritated. She asked, "You saw him too?" That word "too" hit me like cold water. I asked what she meant, and she told me that years earlier, before I moved in, a tenant on the 4th floor had gone missing. A man in his 30s lived in one of the end units for less than a year. People said he had mental health problems. Other people said he was using drugs. The building management told different versions depending on who asked. What everybody agreed on was that neighbors had complained about him standing in the hallway late at night, just standing there, facing people's doors. She said multiple tenants reported opening their doors in the morning and finding him at the far end, already watching. If anyone spoke to him, he either wouldn't answer or would answer too quietly to understand. Then one day, after a bad smell started coming from his apartment, management opened the door. He was inside, dead for several days. I asked her how that made any sense if people had been seeing him in the hall. She stared at me for a second and said, "That's why I moved from this floor the first chance I got." I laughed, but it came out weak. I wanted to dismiss it as apartment gossip, the kind of story every building has. Somebody dies, details get twisted, and after a few years it becomes a local legend. I knew that. I told myself that. But that night, when the elevator opened, I already knew what I was going to see. He was there, same spot, only this time he looked closer. Not actually closer, I realized after a second. He was still at the end of the hall. I could just see more of him because the light overhead wasn't flickering anymore. Dark jacket, dark pants, one side of his face pale in the yellow light. I stood frozen with my keys in my hand. Then, very slowly, he lifted one arm and pointed directly at my apartment door. I don't remember crossing the hall. One second I was by the elevator. The next I was fumbling my key into the lock so hard my hand slipped twice. I got inside, slammed the door, locked everything, and backed away. I was breathing so hard I felt dizzy. After maybe 10 seconds, I forced myself to look through the peephole. The hallway outside my door was empty. Not empty in a comforting way, empty in a wrong way, like it had been cleared out for something. I kept watching, expecting movement from either side. Nothing. Then there was a knock. 3 slow taps. Not loud, not aggressive, just enough to let me know it came from the other side of the door. Every part of me locked up. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I just stared through the peephole, but there was still nobody there. Then the taps came again, same rhythm. The sound was coming from my door, but the peephole showed an empty hallway. I stumbled back and called my brother, mostly because I needed another human voice in my ear. He lived about 20 minutes away. I told him somebody was outside my apartment messing with me. I didn't mention the rest because saying it out loud felt insane. He told me to call the police. I did. They came, checked the floor, checked the stairwell, and found nothing. One of the officers even looked at me in that careful way people do when they're deciding whether you're frightened or unstable. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on my couch until dawn with every light on, watching the door. For the next week, things escalated. I stopped seeing the man every single night. Instead, I'd hear things. A slow footstep in the hallway after midnight, then another, not pacing, not walking past, just one step every so often, always stopping near my door. Sometimes there'd be a soft drag between the steps, like the sole of a shoe sliding against carpet. Once, around 2:30 in the morning, I heard what sounded like someone breathing on the other side of the door. Not exaggerated movie breathing, just the faint rise and fall of a person standing very close. I called the front desk twice more. Both times, security checked and reported nothing. I started taking the stairs instead of the elevator because I hated those first seconds when the doors opened onto the hall. A few days later, I found a fingerprint on the outside of my door, not on the knob, higher up, near eye level, as if somebody had rested their hand flat against the painted wood. The mark looked greasy, almost gray, and the fingers seemed slightly too long. I wiped it away with a paper towel, but I could still see where it had been if the light hit the surface a certain way. That same evening, I knocked on 4B again and asked the woman if she had ever actually seen the man clearly. She hesitated and then said, "Only once." I asked what he looked like. She said, "Like he was listening." That answer made no sense at the time, but I understood it later. The worst night happened on a Sunday. I got home earlier than usual, around 10:40. The hallway lights were brighter than they looked after midnight, and for a moment I felt ridiculous for how scared I'd become of such an ordinary place. Then I noticed every apartment door on my side of the hall was shut except mine. Mine was open, only a few inches, but enough to see darkness inside. I know for a fact I locked it before leaving. I stopped dead. The first thing I thought was burglary. The second thing I thought was that I did not want to see what was waiting in there. I backed all the way to the elevator and hit the button with shaking hands. I could have gone downstairs and called the police from the lobby, but panic makes people stupid. I was too focused on not taking my eyes off the doorway. I kept staring at that black gap, expecting someone to step out. Instead, I saw movement farther down the hall, at the far end. The man was there again, only now he wasn't facing me. He was facing my apartment. Still as ever, head slightly tilted like he'd been standing there watching the door open from the inside. The elevator took forever. I hit the button again and again while staring between him and my apartment. Then, without warning, he moved. It wasn't a walk, it was just suddenly different. One moment, he was at the far end of the hallway. The next, he was halfway there. No sound, no sequence of steps, just closer. My whole body went cold. I threw myself into the elevator the second the doors opened, hit the lobby button, and nearly started crying when the doors finally shut. Police came again. This time, they searched my apartment thoroughly. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. No signs of forced entry. One of them suggested maybe I hadn't shut the door properly before leaving. I told him about the man in the hallway. He asked for a description, wrote it down, and then asked if I wanted medical assistance. That was the moment I realized nobody was going to help me because there was nothing to help against. No evidence, no intruder, no camera footage anyone was willing to show me. Just me sounding less believable every day. The next morning, I went to management and demanded to see the hallway camera. The manager refused at first, saying tenants couldn't access security recordings directly. I got loud enough that she finally agreed to review the footage with me in her office. She pulled up the camera feed from the 4th floor for the previous night. The timestamp rolled forward. There I was, stepping off the elevator, seeing my apartment door open, backing up. And then I stopped breathing. Because in the footage, I was not looking at an empty far end of the hallway. There was someone there, a tall man in dark clothes, perfectly still. The manager paused the video and stared at the screen. I remember that because until then I'd been half convinced I was losing my mind. Seeing her reaction made it worse, not better. She rewound and played it again. The man was there the whole time. until the moment the elevator doors opened. Then, when I stepped inside and turned toward the panel, he was suddenly standing directly outside my apartment door. No walking between points, no blur crossing the hallway. One frame he was at the far end, next frame he was at my door. I asked her to rewind that part 3 times, same result every time. The manager looked sick. She said the file had to be corrupted, maybe frames dropped, maybe the system glitched. But even while she was talking, her voice had changed. She didn't believe what she was saying. Then she zoomed in. It made the image grainy, but you could see his face better. His mouth was open, not wide, just slightly, like he was pressing his ear to my door and listening to something inside. That was what the woman in 4B had meant, like he was listening. The manager shut the footage off and told me she'd escalate it to the property owner. I asked for a copy. She said she couldn't give me one. I pushed harder, and she said the recording had already started failing and might not save properly anyway. I moved out 2 days later. I didn't wait for the lease issue to get sorted out. I didn't care about the deposit. My brother and 2 friends came over during daylight, and I packed everything in 4 hours. The whole time, I refused to go down that hallway alone. Even with people there, I kept feeling like if I looked toward the far end, he'd be standing there again, calm and patient, as if none of it mattered because he knew I'd eventually open a door somewhere. Nothing happened during the move. No sightings, no footsteps. That almost made it worse. It felt like being allowed to leave. A month later, my old neighbor from 4B called me. I'd given her my number in case any mail showed up. She sounded nervous. She said a new tenant had taken my apartment. Young guy, night shift worker. I already knew what she was about to say before she said it. He had started asking people if anyone knew who the man at the end of the 4th floor hallway was. I told her to tell him to move. She asked if I was serious. I said yes. Then I asked her something I'd been trying not to think about. Did anyone ever find out what that man wanted? There was a long pause. Then she said, very quietly, maybe he doesn't want anything. Maybe he's waiting for someone to open the door all the way. I haven't lived in an apartment since. Hotels, sure. Temporary places, maybe. But never a long hallway with identical doors and soft carpet and dim lights. Never that setup again. Because once you've stood in a silent hallway and seen a person at the far end who doesn't move like a person should, you start understanding how thin a locked door really is, and how terrible it feels to realize something outside isn't trying to get in. It's trying to hear whether you're still in there. When I first moved into the apartment, everyone told me the same thing. The walls were thin, the elevator broke twice a month, and the guy in 5C smoked in his bathroom, even though the whole building was supposed to be non-smoking. Nobody warned me about the hallway. It was a long, straight corridor on the 6th floor with dark blue carpet and cream-colored walls that always looked slightly gray at night. The lights were motion-activated, but they never all came on at once. If you walked from one end to the other after midnight, the hallway would brighten in sections ahead of you and fall dark again behind you. It made the whole floor feel longer than it really was, like the corridor never stayed the same length twice. My unit was 6F, almost at the very end, with only one apartment beyond mine. Across from me was 6E, which stayed empty for the first few weeks after I moved in. At the far end past my door was 6G, where an older man named Mr. Delaney lived by himself. I only met him once when he caught the elevator with me carrying groceries. He was thin, polite, and had one of those tired faces that looked like it had been old for a very long time. I was 23, working from home, doing overnight customer support for an overseas company, so my schedule was backwards. Most people on the floor were getting ready for bed around the time I was making coffee and opening my laptop. By 3 or 4 in the morning, when the building was at its quietest, I'd sometimes step out into the hallway to clear my head and make a quick trip to the vending machines near the laundry room. That routine is the only reason I noticed anything at all. The first strange thing happened on a Tuesday at around 3:15 a.m. I opened my door and stepped into the hallway, expecting darkness and silence, but the motion lights were already on all the way to the far end. That was unusual by itself. Normally, only the section nearest my door lit up first. At the other end of the corridor, near 6G, a woman was standing with her back to me. She wore a pale pink robe that reached below her knees, and her dark hair hung loose almost to the middle of her back. She wasn't moving. One hand was lifted near the wall as if she'd just been about to knock on Mr. Delaney's door. I remember thinking I must have opened my door right in the middle of some awkward domestic moment. Maybe an argument. Maybe she'd been locked out. Maybe she was drunk and at the wrong apartment. I took a few steps forward, and my sneaker made that soft, scraping sound carpeted hallways always do. She didn't react. Not even a small turn of the head. That was what made me stop. Most people respond somehow when they hear a door open behind them in an otherwise silent hallway. A glance, a shift, some sign they know they're not alone. She stayed perfectly still, facing the wall beside 6G. I almost said, "Are you okay?" But something about how motionless she was made me decide not to. I turned around, went back inside, and watched through my peephole for maybe half a minute. She never moved. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being weird and nosy, so I just stayed inside the rest of the night and forgot about the vending machine. The next evening, I ran into Mr. Delaney near the mailboxes and casually asked if he had family visiting. He frowned and said no. I asked if maybe a nurse or caretaker stopped by late. He looked a little amused and said he wasn't that far gone yet. Then I described the woman in the pink robe. The expression on his face changed so quickly it made my stomach drop. He stared at me for a second and asked very quietly, "You saw her in the hallway?" I laughed because it suddenly felt like I'd stepped into a joke everyone else understood except me. I said, "Yeah, last night, by your door." He kept looking at me, and I noticed his hands were trembling around the stack of junk mail he was holding. Then he said, "Don't open your door if you hear knocking after 2. I honestly thought he was messing with me. I smiled and said, "What?" He repeated it exactly the same way. "Don't open your door if you hear knocking after 2 in the morning." Then he walked away before I could ask anything else. That should have been enough for me to feel stupid and brush it off as old man superstition. But that night, around 2:40 a.m., while I was answering emails at my desk, I heard a knock from the hallway. 3 soft taps. Not on my door, somewhere farther down the corridor. A few seconds later, 3 more. Then silence. Then 3 more again. The pattern continued just irregularly enough to feel deliberate, not frantic, not angry, patient, like someone going from door to door and waiting each time. I muted my headset and listened. The knocks slowly got closer. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Each set seemed to come from the next apartment down, then the next, then the next. I don't know why I didn't immediately call building security. Maybe because part of me still believed there had to be a normal explanation. Maybe because apartment buildings train you to ignore other people's strange behavior unless it becomes impossible to ignore. The knocking reached the door across from mine. 3 soft taps. A long silence. Then my motion light clicked on under the door. I froze in my chair. The light from the hall drew a thin line under my front door, and I could see the faintest shift of shadow on the other side. Someone was standing there. Then came 3 knocks on my door. Soft, careful, almost polite. Every hair on my arm stood up. I didn't move. I didn't speak. A few seconds passed, then 3 more knocks. Same rhythm. I crept toward the door without making a sound and looked through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. My light was on. The corridor was lit all the way to the far end, but there was no one there. I kept staring, trying to force my eyes to adjust, convinced someone had to be just out of view. Then, slowly, at the very end of the hall near 6G, I saw her. The woman in the pink robe, standing with her back to me again. So far away she should not have been able to knock on my door seconds earlier. I stumbled back so fast I hit the wall behind me. I didn't sleep at all after that. At 6 in the morning, when the sun was up and everything looked harmless again, I went downstairs and asked the concierge if anyone had complained about a woman wandering the 6th floor at night. He said no. I asked if the cameras covered the hallway. He said yes, but only management could access the recordings. When I described her, he shrugged and told me maybe somebody's guest had gotten confused. I didn't mention the part about the empty hallway. That same afternoon, I knocked on Mr. Delaney's door. He opened it only a few inches, chain still on. When he saw it was me, he seemed relieved, but not by much. I told him I'd heard the knocking. For a moment, he just closed his eyes. Not dramatically, more like he was tired of hearing confirmation of something he already knew. Then he let me in. His apartment smelled faintly like old books and peppermint tea. Everything inside was neat, almost carefully neat, like a person trying to make order hold together. He motioned for me to sit at the kitchen table and asked if I'd open the door. I said no. He nodded once and said, "Good." I asked who the woman was. He took a long time answering. Finally, he said that years ago, before I moved in, a woman had lived on our floor in 6E, the apartment across from mine. Her name was Leanne. She was in her late 20s, and from what people gathered, she'd been going through some kind of breakdown. Tenants heard her crying through the walls, heard her talking to someone when nobody else was inside, heard her pacing the hallway at night in slippers and a robe, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen her husband. The problem was, according to everyone in the building, she didn't have a husband, or at least nobody had ever seen one. Management warned her several times after residents complained. Then, one winter night, she started knocking on doors after midnight, saying someone was following her through the hallway, but disappearing whenever she turned around. A few people opened their doors and told her to calm down. One threatened to call the police. After that, nobody wanted to get involved. A week later, she was found dead inside 6E. I asked how. Mr. Delaney looked toward the wall we shared with the corridor and said, "No one agrees on that part." That answer irritated me. I thought he was being intentionally cryptic, feeding into his own creepy story. I asked what that had to do with the knocking now. He stared at me for a few seconds before saying, "Because after she died, people kept hearing her." I wish I could say I stood up and left right then, but the way he said it didn't sound theatrical. It sounded exhausted, like repeating something he hated knowing. He told me the hallway had gone through phases over the years, long quiet periods, then months where someone on the floor would start hearing knocks late at night, sometimes one door, sometimes several. A few tenants reported seeing a woman in a pink robe, usually with her back turned. Management blamed pranks, plumbing noises, dreams, mental health, anything except what residents actually described. I asked why he never moved. He gave a small, humorless smile and said, "At my age, all apartments start to feel temporary." Then he leaned forward and said the part I remember most clearly. "She only knocks when she thinks someone is inside with you." I just stared at him. I asked what that meant, and he shook his head and said, "I don't know, but the ones who opened their doors said she always looked frightened. Not angry, frightened." I wanted to reject the whole story on the spot, but I also couldn't stop thinking about that empty hallway and the impossible distance between my door and the figure at the far end. That night, I put a chair under my doorknob like that was going to do anything. I kept my TV on low for background noise and tried to work as if I wasn't listening for every sound outside. At 2:17 a.m., I heard the first knock. Not distant this time, right across the hall. 3 taps on 6E. I turned all the sound off and waited. Nothing for about 20 seconds. Then 3 taps on my door. I didn't move. Another pause. Then, for the first time, I heard a voice, very soft, female. Not on the other side of the apartment, not in my head, right outside the door. Don't. That was all. One word, barely above a whisper. I should have run. I should have called the police. Instead, I went to the peephole again, hands shaking so badly I had to brace myself against the wall. The woman was standing directly outside my apartment, not with her back turned this time, facing my door. Her robe was the faded pink I'd seen before, but close up it looked old, almost colorless in the hallway light. Her hair hung in damp-looking strands around her face. I couldn't make out every detail through the distortion of the peephole, but her expression was clear enough. She looked terrified, not sad, not blank. Terrified. Her eyes were wide and fixed on the wood of my door, like she wasn't looking at me through it, but at something behind it. Then she slowly lifted one hand and placed her fingers against the door. I made a sound before I could stop myself, just a tiny startled breath. Her eyes snapped upward, directly toward the peephole. And then every light in the hallway went out. The darkness on the other side was absolute. I jerked back so hard I nearly fell. A second later, something hit my front door from the hallway side. Not a knock, a full body impact that shook the frame. Then another. Then silence. I stood there, unable to breathe, waiting for a third hit, but instead I heard something much worse. Footsteps, fast, heavy, running down the hallway toward the far end. Not one set. It sounded wrong, irregular, like someone sprinting with an uneven gait and brushing the walls as they went. Then nothing. The hallway lights came back on, one section at a time. I stayed where I was until sunrise. The next morning, there were 4 deep scratches on the outside of my door, all clustered just below the peephole. They looked fresh. The paint had curled slightly around them. Building management finally took me seriously after that, or at least pretended to. A maintenance worker came up, examined the scratches, and suggested maybe someone's dog had jumped against the door. On the 6th floor, at 3 in the morning, I asked to see the security footage. They refused. I called the police anyway, and when they came out, they took notes, looked at the door, and asked if I had any enemies. One of them actually said stress can do strange things when you live alone. That was the point where I stopped expecting help from anybody. 2 nights later, Mr. Delaney died. They said it was natural causes, heart failure in his sleep. I found out because there were paramedics in the hallway that morning, and his door stood open while 2 building staff whispered nearby with those stiff, careful faces people wear around fresh death. As soon as I heard, something cold settled into me, because the previous night, just after 2, I'd heard knocking at his door. 3 slow taps, a pause, then again. I had almost gone out to check on him. Almost. For the rest of that day, the 6th floor felt different, quieter, but not in a peaceful way, more like the whole corridor was listening. By midnight, both 6E and 6G were dark. One empty apartment across from me, one newly dead neighbor at the far end. I kept every light in my place on. At 2:03 a.m., the knocking started. Not moving from door to door this time, just one set of 3 knocks on 6E, then 3 knocks on 6G, back and forth, across the hallway and down the corridor, like something was checking both ends. I stood in the middle of my living room with my phone in my hand, too scared to go near the door, too scared not to. Then it stopped. 30 seconds passed. Maybe a minute. Then came 3 knocks on my door. Before I could even think, the whisper came again. "Don't let him in." I ran to the peephole. The woman was there, closer than ever, her face pale and drawn, eyes huge with panic. But she wasn't looking at my door anymore. She was looking down the hallway to my left. Very slowly, without taking her eyes off whatever she saw, she shook her head at me. Then she mouthed something. I couldn't read it the first time. She mouthed it again. "Behind you." I turned so fast I almost blacked out. My apartment was empty. living room, kitchen, the short hallway to the bedroom, all exactly as they should have been. When I looked back through the peephole, she was gone. In her place, the hallway stood empty for half a second. Then the motion lights near my door clicked brighter as someone stepped into range from the blind side of the corridor. A man, tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes that looked almost black against the washed-out walls. He wasn't walking normally. He moved with a strange stiffness, like every step had to be remembered before it could be taken. His face was turned slightly down, so I couldn't see all of it, just a sharp cheek and a mouth hanging open a little too far. He stopped right outside my door. Then he lifted his hand and knocked. 3 soft taps, exactly the same as the others. I don't know why, but that was the moment something in my fear changed shape. It became clearer, colder. I understood with total certainty that the woman had never been the thing trying to get in. She had been warning people. I backed away from the door and went for my phone to call 911, but before I could dial, I heard the deadbolt turn. Just a small metallic shift. My blood turned to ice. I always lock that deadbolt. Always. I stared at the door, unable to process what I was hearing. Then it turned again, slowly, as if someone on the other side was trying to work it with incredible patience. There was no way, no key, no explanation. I dragged the kitchen table across the floor and jammed it against the door, then shoved the couch behind it, all while the deadbolt kept giving those tiny, experimental clicks. No banging, no force, just testing, as if whatever was outside knew time was on its side. Then I heard the whisper one last time, faint and urgent, not at the door, but somewhere near my bedroom. Window. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my phone, wallet, and keys, ran to the bedroom, threw the window up, and climbed onto the fire escape in bare feet. The metal was freezing. My hands slipped on the rail as I went down faster than I should have. By the time I hit the second landing, my legs were shaking so hard I nearly missed a step. I never heard the front door open above me, but I heard something else. 3 soft knocks on the bedroom window I had just climbed through. I looked up. A figure stood inside my bedroom, mostly hidden by the darkness of the room behind him. Tall, motionless, one hand still raised against the glass. No face I could clearly see, just shape. I got down the rest of the fire escape so fast I tore skin off one palm. I spent the rest of that night in the emergency room waiting area because it was the only place open and bright and full of other people. The next morning, I went back with my cousin and 2 building employees to collect my things. I did not tell them why I refused to enter alone. I did not tell them why I would not go near the front door until every blind corner in the apartment had been checked. I moved out that same day. A month later, after too many calls and threats, management finally agreed to email me a still image taken from the hallway camera the night I fled. They said they were only doing it to prove there had been no intruder and no sign of forced entry. The image showed my apartment door at 2:11 a.m. Standing outside it was the woman in the pink robe, facing the camera for once. Her hand was lifted in a warning gesture, like she was trying to hold something back. And behind the small, wired glass window in the door of empty apartment 6E, directly across from mine, there was a face looking out. A man's face, pale, stretched, and smiling. Management never answered my follow-up emails asking why a supposedly vacant apartment had someone inside it. I later found out 6E stayed empty for almost 3 years after I left. According to another tenant I kept in touch with, People kept hearing knocking on that floor after 2 in the morning, sometimes on 6E, sometimes on doors near it, sometimes moving slowly down the hall until somebody turned on a light or looked through a peephole. And every now and then, one resident or another would report seeing a woman in a pink robe standing with her back to them at the far end of the corridor, as if she was waiting to make sure they went back inside. I still live in an apartment now, but never on a long hallway and never near the end of one. And I have one rule I don't break for anyone. If somebody knocks after 2 in the morning, I don't care who they claim to be, how scared they sound, or how polite the knocking is. I do not open the door. Because there are some things in apartment hallways that don't want to come in by force. They just need you to believe the wrong person is the danger. By the time I moved into the building, I had already lived in enough bad apartments to think I knew every kind of nighttime noise. Pipes knocking in the walls, ice makers dropping cubes at weird hours, someone arguing 2 floors down, the soft thud of a neighbor getting home late and kicking off their shoes. Apartment buildings were full of sounds that seemed sinister until you learned their source. That confidence lasted about 6 weeks in my place on the 8th floor. It was a newer building than most of the places I'd rented before. Not luxury, but trying hard to look like it. Gray walls, black trim, bright white doors, long carpeted hallways with recessed lights in the ceiling. The management loved words like secure and modern and quiet. The front entrance needed a code after 10. The elevators only worked if you scanned your fob. There were cameras at both ends of every hallway. That was one of the reasons I felt comfortable there, even living alone. My unit was 8H, near the middle of the east hallway. The corridor stretched a long way in both directions, broken only by identical doors, framed prints of city skylines, and little alcoves with fake plants no one ever watered. During the day, it looked bland and expensive. At night, it was different. Too evenly lit, too still. It felt less like part of a building and more like a place designed to be empty. I worked freelance video editing, mostly for clients overseas, so I kept late hours. It wasn't unusual for me to be awake until 3 or 4 in the morning. Around that time, the building always went silent in a way that made even small noises stand out. Elevator hum, vent clicks, distant plumbing. Every sound had space around it. The first thing that unsettled me wasn't dramatic. It was just this. One night, around 2:50 a.m., I heard someone walking slowly in the hallway outside my apartment. Not unusual by itself. People came and went at all hours. What made me pay attention was the pace. One step, a pause, another step, a pause. Not someone heading somewhere, not even pacing, just moving slowly enough that I became aware of each footfall separately. I muted my headphones and listened. The steps came from the far left side of the hallway and moved gradually closer to my door. Then they stopped. I waited for a knock, a key in a lock, a voice, anything that would explain why someone had stopped there. Nothing. After about 20 seconds, the footsteps resumed, still slow, still measured, continuing past my apartment toward the other end of the corridor. That was it. I forgot about it by the next afternoon. Then it happened again the following night. Same time, give or take 10 minutes. Same slow approach, same pause outside my door. This time I went to the peephole. The hallway was empty, completely empty. I stayed there longer than I want to admit, one eye pressed to the glass, waiting for somebody to come into view from one side or the other. No one did. The corridor just sat there under the ceiling lights, blank and quiet, every apartment door shut. Then, while I was still looking, I heard one more footstep, right outside my door. I jerked back hard enough to hit the wall behind me. When I looked again, the hallway was still empty. I did what anybody tries to do first. I explained it away. Maybe the peephole angle was bad. Maybe someone had stopped in the camera blind spot by the frame. Maybe I'd heard a sound from another floor that carried strangely through the vents. Once you start offering yourself reasonable explanations, fear gets quieter for a while. I even joked about it a few days later with a woman from 8K while we were both waiting for the elevator. She was maybe in her early 40s, always dressed for work, always looked tired. I said, "Have you ever noticed how weirdly sound carries in this hallway at night?" I expected a normal answer. Instead, she looked at me for a second and asked, "Do you hear the walking too?" The way she said "too" made my stomach tighten. I laughed, but only because I suddenly felt embarrassed. I asked what she meant. She glanced toward the hall camera near the ceiling, then back at me, and lowered her voice. "Slow footsteps. They stop outside certain doors." I asked how she knew they stopped outside certain doors. She said, "Because one night, they stopped outside mine for almost a minute." Then the elevator opened, and she got in without saying anything else. That should have been my cue to ask more questions, but I didn't. Part of me didn't want details. Details make things real. The next week, the sounds got worse. The footsteps didn't happen every night, but when they did, they always started between 2:30 and 3:15 a.m. They would move along the hallway at that awful, deliberate pace, stop outside my door, then continue on. Once or twice I heard them pause outside other apartments too, but never for as long as mine. The worst part was that there was never any other sound attached to them. No rustle of clothes, no phone, no keys, no breathing. Just footsteps, each one distinct, as if a person were walking very carefully and wanting to be heard. One Friday, after another sleepless night, I emailed building management and asked whether they'd had complaints about someone wandering the 8th floor after hours. They replied with a cheerful canned message about how the property was monitored 24/7 and how resident safety was a top priority. They told me to contact the front desk immediately if I witnessed suspicious activity. I almost let it go. Then, 2 nights later, I heard the footsteps stop outside my door again, and along with them came a sound so soft I nearly missed it. A hand sliding across the wood. Not knocking, not scratching, just fingertips moving lightly over the outside of the door, like someone tracing the grain. I backed away from my desk so fast my chair rolled into the kitchen counter. I stood there staring at the door while that faint sound continued for maybe 3 seconds, then stopped. After another long pause, the footsteps moved on. I called the front desk. The night concierge, a young guy named Mateo, said he'd come up and check. I stayed by the peephole until the elevator opened and he stepped out in his navy blazer, looking more annoyed than concerned. I opened the door with the chain on and told him exactly what I'd heard. He walked the hallway from one end to the other, checked both stairwell doors, even looked into the little trash room near the west side. Nothing. When he came back, he gave me a careful smile and said, "Maybe someone was headed home and had a bit too much to drink." I asked if he could check the camera. He hesitated for just a second too long and then said only management had access. The next morning, I found a mark on my door. It was a long streak about 6 inches high, right near where a person's hand would rest. The paint looked dull there, as if something oily had been dragged over it. I tried wiping it off, but it didn't disappear completely. That evening, I knocked on 8K. The woman who answered looked like she'd hoped it wasn't me. I told her I'd found a mark on my door and asked if she'd ever seen anything herself, not just heard it. She stood there a moment, then opened the door a little wider and let me in. Her apartment was spotless in a way that suggested stress, not neatness. Everything arranged too carefully, nothing left out. She told me her name was Rena. Then she asked how long I'd lived in the building. I said not quite 2 months. She nodded like that explained something. According to her, the 8th floor had a reputation residents mostly passed around quietly because management shut down complaints fast. 3 years earlier, a man living in 8B had called security multiple times saying someone was walking the hall at night and stopping outside his apartment. Security found nothing. A few weeks later, another tenant on the same floor reported hearing slow footsteps and something brushing against her door around 3 in the morning. Then, more people started mentioning it. Never everyone, never enough at once for management to treat it as a pattern. Just scattered complaints from people on our floor, especially from those who stayed up late. I asked what happened to the man in 8B. Rena looked away and said he moved out suddenly. The way she said it made me ask whether that was true. She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "That's what management told people." I asked what she thought happened. She said that one night police and paramedics came to 8B and the apartment was empty by the next afternoon. No one on the floor ever got a straight answer. But after that, the footsteps were heard less often for a while. I remember getting irritated then because it felt like she was leaning into the mystery instead of just being clear. I asked her, "Are you saying somebody died?" She took a breath and said, "I'm saying the people who hear it most are usually the ones living alone." That answer chilled me more than if she'd said yes. I left her apartment feeling worse, not better, because now I had just enough information to be scared and not enough to do anything useful with it. That same night, I dragged a chair under my doorknob before going back to work. It was stupid. I knew it was stupid. But fear doesn't need logic to make you start arranging furniture. At 3:07 a.m., the footsteps came again. I heard them enter the hall from the east stairwell side. Slow, even, unhurried. They stopped outside 8G first, then moved on. Then 8H, my apartment. I held my breath and stared at the door. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then came 3 soft knocks. I actually felt relief for half a second. Knocking was normal. Knocking meant person. Person meant explainable. But before I could move, a voice spoke from the other side. A man's voice, low, calm. "I know you're awake." Every muscle in my body locked. The voice didn't sound drunk, didn't sound angry. If anything, it sounded patient, conversational, like we were already in the middle of something. I didn't answer. A few seconds passed. Then he said, "You shouldn't look through the peephole." I don't know how to describe what that did to me. Fear is one thing when it comes from a sound or a shape. It becomes something worse when it sounds aware of you. I backed away from the door, phone already in my hand, and dialed 911. While it rang, I heard one soft tap against the wood. Not a knock, more like a fingernail. Then the footsteps moved away. Police came. They checked the hall, the stairs, the lobby, even the parking garage. No one. One officer took my statement while the other looked at the door and the chair jammed under the knob. I told them exactly what the voice said. The older officer asked whether I had any recent issues with an ex, a coworker, or anyone who knew my schedule. I said no. He nodded in a way that said he didn't know what else to offer me. The next day, I went straight to management and refused to leave until someone reviewed the camera footage from the 8th floor. The property manager, a woman named Elise, finally brought me into her office with an expression that made it clear she thought I was becoming a problem. She loaded the hallway recording from 3 o'clock to 3:15 a.m. At first, the feed looked normal. Empty hall, closed doors, clean lighting. Then the timestamp reached 3:06. The motion-sensing camera near the east end flickered slightly, and the image distorted for just a frame. When it cleared, there was a man standing in the hallway, not entering from the stairwell, not stepping out of an apartment, just there, about halfway down the corridor facing toward my door. Elise paused the footage, rewound it, played it again. Same thing. No transition. One frame empty, next frame occupied. The man was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. His head was slightly bent forward. Even on camera, there was something wrong with the way he held himself. Not limp, not stiff exactly, just unnatural, like he was imitating posture instead of using it. I felt cold all over. Elise tried to explain it away immediately. Compression error, frame corruption, camera lag. Then the video continued. The man walked toward my apartment in those same slow, measured steps I'd been hearing for weeks. He stopped outside my door and stood there for almost 40 seconds without moving. Then he lifted one hand and touched the wood. I asked her to turn the sound on, but the hallway cameras didn't record audio. He stayed outside my door a little longer, then moved on. The footage followed him only until he reached the far west end of the corridor. Then the screen glitched again. One frame of distortion, and he was gone. Not opening the stairwell, not entering any apartment. Gone. Elise stopped talking after that. I asked her for a copy of the footage. She said she couldn't provide resident surveillance files without approval from corporate. I asked whether anyone else had seen this before. She said, too quickly, no. That was how I knew she was lying. I went home, shaking so badly I had to sit on my kitchen floor for a few minutes before I could stand again. I should have left that day. I know that now. But leaving isn't always simple when you're broke and your lease still has months left, and part of your brain keeps insisting there must still be a logical explanation hiding somewhere. So I stayed one more night. I barely worked. I kept the TV on, every light on, and my phone charging beside me. I told myself that if anything happened again, I'd go straight to a hotel and figure the rest out later. At 2:43 a.m., I heard the footsteps. This time they were different, faster, not running, but no longer slow enough to count individually. A steady approach from the far west end, coming straight toward my apartment. They stopped outside my door. Immediately, the doorknob turned, just once, hard. I screamed before I meant to. Then came 3 knocks. Then the man's voice again, quieter than before. "Please let me in." I backed into the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife I had. Though, even while I did it, I knew how useless that would be if the door opened. The knob turned again. Then again. Not frantic, just persistent. Then the voice said, in the same calm tone, "He's behind you." I spun around. Nothing. Kitchen empty. Living room empty. Bedroom doorway dark, but empty. When I looked back, the shadow under my front door had changed. There were now 2 shapes blocking the light from the hall, one at normal standing height, and one lower, much lower, like someone crouching right outside the door. I started crying then, not loudly, just the kind of breathless panic crying that comes when your body has finally decided it can't keep acting brave. I called 911 again and could barely get the address out. While I was still on the phone, something slid through the gap beneath the door. At first, I thought it was paper. Then I saw fingers. Human-looking fingers, pale and thin, pressing inward under the tiny space at the bottom, impossibly flattening as they searched across the floor like they were trying to feel for my feet. I stumbled backwards so fast I nearly fell over the coffee table. The dispatcher kept asking me if someone had entered. I couldn't answer properly. I just kept saying, "They're under the door. Their hand is under the door." Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the hand withdrew. The hallway went silent. Police arrived in less than 10 minutes. It felt like an hour. They found nobody. No one in the corridor, no sign of forced entry, no handprints they could see. One officer even got on his knees and checked the gap beneath the door like he expected to find fibers or blood or some physical clue that would make the story easier to process. There was nothing. I told them about the footage management had shown me. That got their attention. Not enough to make them say they believed me, but enough that one of them went downstairs to speak with Elise. He came back looking frustrated and told me management was reviewing internal materials. That same morning, I packed a bag and left for a hotel. Around noon, Rena from 8K called me. I hadn't given her my number. That scared me before she even said anything. She told me Elise had gone apartment to apartment on the 8th floor, asking whether anyone had spoken to me recently. Rena told her no. Then she said I needed to know one more thing. Years earlier, before the tenants started mentioning footsteps, a man had died in the hallway on our floor. Not in an apartment, in the actual hallway. According to what residents pieced together, he had been found near 8B late at night, collapsed against a door that wasn't his. Management apparently kept details vague, called it a medical emergency, cleaned the carpet, and moved on. But after that, people began reporting footsteps, then knocks, then, in a few cases, a voice asking to be let in. I asked how she knew all that if management denied everything. She said one of the older maintenance workers had been there that night, and after a few drinks one Christmas, he'd told a group of tenants something he shouldn't have. When staff found the man in the hallway, his face had been turned toward the apartment door in front of him, and one hand had been shoved flat beneath it, as if he had been trying desperately to reach someone inside. I checked out of the hotel the next day, only long enough to return to the building with 2 friends and empty my apartment. Management tried to talk me into staying. Elise actually said they were prepared to transfer me to another unit on a different floor. I told her there was no amount of rent credit on earth that would keep me there. While my friends carried boxes to the elevator, I made one final mistake. I looked down the west end of the hallway. It was empty. Then the camera near the ceiling gave a tiny flicker, just a blink, and for that single instant, I saw him. Standing at the far end of the corridor, tall, dark clothes, head bent slightly forward, waiting. When the image steadied, the hall was empty again. I left with the last load and never went back. A month later, Rena emailed me. Just one line. A new tenant had moved into my old unit. 3 nights after moving in, he filed a complaint about someone walking in the hallway around 3 in the morning and stopping outside his door. I deleted the email and blocked the address because I didn't want updates. I didn't want confirmation. I didn't want the story to keep living in my head with fresh details attached to it. But some things don't need updates. Some things only need patterns, and I know the pattern now. If you live alone in a long apartment hallway and you start hearing footsteps that move too slowly, too carefully, stopping outside your door night after night, do not tell yourself you're imagining it. Do not go to the peephole because curiosity is stronger than fear. Do not listen if a calm voice on the other side of the door sounds polite. And whatever you do, if you ever see fingers feeling their way in under the gap at the bottom, do not stand there trying to understand how that's possible. Because whatever is outside already knows something you don't. It knows you're home, and it's checking whether there's enough space to reach you.